Are you guys supposed to be muted?
Sorry,
That's
can you
better.
hear?
I can hear you now.
Sorry about that. So I was just introducing Gilbert Goebel. She's our new administrative assistant here at Plan RDA. So we filled that position that was earlier this year.
What was your name again?
Gilbert.
Gilbert?
Gilbert.
Gilbert.
Right.
And last.
Goebel. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Go. Gogel. Today is her second day. So she's been scheduled to shadow different members of staff. And so today she's just really here to get a feel for how committee meeting looks in the agency. But
Wonderful.
we're glad that you're here. Welcome.
Well, great.
And then I know Dan is going to introduce Mark Rhodes at that part in the agenda. So.
All right, very good. All right. Okay, thank you very much for that. Regarding virtual participation of members, all our members are here for the most part at this point. So we are in fact in person. Item 2, administrative items, July meeting minutes on page 3, which are us. We can take a few moments to scan them if you would and see if there's anything you'd like to add or critique from the minutes. Okay. All right, we have a few things in there that will be certainly important to discuss coming up, especially regarding the space and other issues and even system upgrade. So if everyone's in agreement, we may have a motion to approve the minutes, or would you like to defer that till a little later?
I'll be abstaining, I wasn't at the
Yep, okay, one abstention. So, Farley.
I'll move that we approve those minutes, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Farley. You can move, and I'll second. We've been moving. All those in favor of approving the minutes with one extension, say aye.
Well, I've got to abstain on the, are we doing the November or?
Well, the
or
October
both?
one, there weren't enough people present.
Yeah, so we just.
Kind of hate to say we did.
Okay, I was just doing.
Yeah, I wasn't there, and that's why.
I was just
That's
doing July. Did we do the July?
July.
Okay, through July.
Yeah. You
We're
mean
just
to
doing July.
rephrase my motion and say just for July?
Just for July. Wonderful. Okay, well, let's move down to, well, let me finish that on the July. It's been moved and properly second, and we'll, those in favor, ayes have it, and one abstention on the July minutes. Thank you very much. Now, relative to October meeting minutes, what's your pleasure? They're relatively short,
Yeah, that
because we didn't have a
does,
quorum.
yeah, we didn't.
So we
have
need a
quorum.
quorum to approve these, so.
So there are only 2 of us here. So we should have minutes, just to say.
Yeah.
So I'll move the minutes as presented.
Thank you. It's been moved, and I'll probably second those. All those in favor of approving those minutes for October, please say aye. Ayes have it. Any abstentions?
Abstain.
One abstention, 2 abstentions. Okay, very good. Fine. 2 abstentions. Therefore, those minutes for October 26th are now approved. Thank you for that. I do remember that name. Next item is our financial report for audit draft review, page 7, financial report. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Okay,
What would you like to do?
I've been with Plan RBA since about February and March. So it's a little interesting for me to introduce, Mark Rhodes, the auditor, who's been the auditor for the organization for several years. It was a pleasure to work with him and his staff, and appreciated the work that he did to bring this to fruition. Kind of the purpose of this conversation is to present the financials, but also to serve as a direct communication of the auditor to the organization, to plan RBA, to, the governance and certain audit requirements. And so at this point, I'll just turn it over to Mark, and, he'll walk us through
Very
what
good.
he deems.
All right, welcome, Mark. Good to have
Thank you.
you.
If you would like, I could share my screen and then Martha won't have to try and keep up with me while I'm jumping from page to page.
That works for me, sir.
So just so you have permission.
Making sure.
Okay.
And you don't see it, right?
No, yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure why it's, oh, there it is. All right, do you see the audit?
Yeah.
Is that clear enough?
Zoom in, Mark, that would be really helpful, maybe to 200%. Thank you.
Yep. Now we can see.
Do you have
Yeah,
that
for
on
sure.
this in front of you?
Yeah, just so he gets page numbers. And we can usually figure out where.
What's that?
We can see it.
Okay. I'm going to go fairly quickly through this. So if you have questions, please, you can interrupt me, or you can wait till the end and we can go back to anything that I didn't cover. To start off on page 3 of the report is the independent auditors report. And this is our standard unmodified. So we did not identify any weaknesses on internal control or in compliance, which I'll cover also in the report later. So that's just, like I said, it's a standard clean opinion.
Okay.
Then you can work into, starting on page 6 of the report. I guess it's 6 of my PDF, it's page 4, number 4, is the management discussion and analysis. This gives the summarization of the activity for the year, gives a little in-depth information about the ins and outs. And then scrolling through to the net position, we show current assets comparative for 2020 and 2021. Current assets increased primarily because timing difference with some receivables at year end for 21. And deferred outflows, this is associated with the VRS liability. And so there was a large adjustment this year. Current liabilities are relatively similar. The net pension liability did go up. Again, this is a VRS adjustment, which makes sense because they were evaluating these in June of 2020. So that would have been after the pandemic had started and the market had dropped. So hopefully it'll be better when they do the June 2021 reports for fiscal year 22. And your deferred outflows are again also associated with the VRS pension adjustments.
Adjustment amount, could you say that? I know it's back in the report, but
Say that again, please.
what was the amount of the adjustment? You said relatively large.
The liability, well, you look at the change in the deferred outflows, the deferred liability of the pension and the deferred inflows, and it's at $111,000 GASB adjustment, which is on page number 12, the statement of activity in general revenues after operations.
Okay, page number 12, got you. All right, I see it.
Then looking at the statement of activities, comparing the 2 years, a little more was being spent on project costs. In total, revenue was down from the prior year. There seemed to be a reduction in the amount of activity on some of the VDOT and the VDEM reports.
What page is this? I apologize.
For 8, I think.
8 or 9? 8.
He's got 8 on 3.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that is page number 8 of the report.
Right.
And
Right.
page 9 gives a breakdown by expenses and revenue sources. Again, it's seeing that there was a reduction in some of the VDOT and VDEM funding for this year. Increase in some local funding, which would be some special assessments. Not the whole thing, but just some local funding. Running through, let's see. Taking you to the statement of net position, this just breaks down the information that you received earlier into a little more detail so you can see the amounts. Sorry, I jumped there. Statement activity is just the same thing that you've already seen from the management discussion and analysis. Looking at the statement of revenues, expenditures, this is on page 14 of the draft. This is breaking it down in association with the budgeted numbers, but this is showing you that your fund balance is still above the threshold that was set of $1 million, and that it had increased by almost 170. And below that, there's a reconciliation to get you back down to the change in that position for the year. And you can see that $111,000 from the VRS, the GASB 68 adjustment is impacting it. This year you have a fiduciary fund with your Central Virginia Transportation. So they're showing that there's a $68,000 receivable due from them. And the basic expenses that were spent for their purpose. After that, we get into the footnotes, which I'm not going to delve into, just unless somebody has some specific questions. Back on page 38 of the draft, this is taking the actual and comparing it to your budget and showing differences by the funding sources and the expense line items.
What page was that?
It is page number 38 Then the final two reports on there are associated with the pension funding and the expenses and the ins and outs for the whole. Well, this one's covering a 10-year period of the pension. On page 42 is the statement of expenditures of federal awards. So for this year, which has been true for most years, we've identified that the major program was the Department of Transportation funding. You had $1.1 million funding expended there. In total, you had $2 million worth of federal awards, or rather federal expenditures.
Which page are we on?
That was page 442.
Okay, okay.
Now, although it's under the Richmond Regional Planning District Commission, isn't this the Transportation Planning Organization? Isn't this their money?
We're the fiscal agent for the Richmond Regional Transportation Planning Organization. So,
So it does.
so it's recorded on our financial statements and our annual audit. Our RTPO does not have its own set of financial statements.
I will just mention that has caused problems in the past, and
Mhm.
I'm not going to get into it, but since we're discussing this, but this has always been an issue that we should keep, but they are totally separate on this page. Is that it?
They're accounted for separately,
Separate.
but because our RTPO is not a legal entity and doesn't hold a bank account, the dollars are the responsibility of the regional commission to manage.
But they are kept separate, like with this. I mean, that there's a,
Tracked and recorded and reported separately, yes.
and I assume very similarly, the Central Virginia Transportation Authority will be handled totally separately, right?
That's different because the fiscal agent for the Central Virginia Transportation Authority is actually Chesterfield County.
Okay, so
And so
they
the
are.
fund that you see, PTA, it's administrative portion that Plan RVA administers. The bulk of the funds are actually administered and distributed and managed and accounted for in the audit or the CBTA legal entity, and then the county's statements as well.
So
Chesterfield.
2/3 of all funds coming to Plan RVA are actually coming through the TPO.
Yeah,
$2
I mean,
million.
yeah, the work
three.
program for the MPO is about $2 million a year.
So it's 2/3.
Yeah.
Well, it's just that when the federal government wants to audit, they have to be kept totally separate. That's what.
I mean, the grant awards for the MPO are actually between the state and federal agencies and the Planning District Commission. So the grant agreements are with the Planning District Commission, and you hold the responsibility for administering and complying with all financial and programmatic requirements. The direction of the expenditure of the funds sits with the TPO. So the members of the Transportation Planning Organization set the priorities, approve the unified plan, and our staff are directly accountable to them. But we are the fiscal agent and grantee of record for the MPO.
Excuse me, so CVTA goes through Chesterfield?
Right
But your
now,
administrative expenses are going through Plan RVA?
that's right. So the Central Virginia Transportation Authority for this fiscal year, as an example, has a $500,000 administrative budget.
Mhm.
And so that is managed by Chesterfield County. They are the fiscal agent for the CVTA in whole. However, Plan RVA advances all of the CBTA's administrative costs, and then we are reimbursed on a quarterly basis. So
From
that's why,
Chesterfield.
that's
Oh.
right. So that's why you see it reported in our audit this year as a separate fund,
Right.
because they're not activities of material benefit to Plan RVA, they are activities of material benefit to the CBTA.
Okay, okay.
Continue in the future with the CBTA.
For this fiscal year, it would be reported the same. Depending on how the CBTA chooses to structure its staffing and fiscal responsibility in the future.
Okay, so that's.
CDTA has a memorandum
Memo.
right now, continuing forward through
June
June
30th.
30th.
Yes.
Of 2020.
With Chesterfield.
With
Or with Plan
Chesterfield
R-
and Plan
and Plan
RVA, and Plan RVA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that,
And then, I'm sorry, how long does that go for?
The current agreement that we have with the CBTA is through June 30th of 2022, the current fiscal year.
Okay.
So we will expect to see a similar statement of CBTA administrative activities in our audit for at least this fiscal year.
Okay.
But beyond that, we haven't, we'll be discussing in the next couple months whether or not an extension will be agreed upon. And then the fiscal agent responsibility sits with Chesterfield County through a separate fiscal agent agreement between CBTA and Chesterfield County. And that, at this point, actually does not have an expiration date. And so those two will have to mutually agree to continue that relationship.
So is that, or would they be audited through Chesterfield's audit?
So the accounting happens in the county's general ledger. However, the audit is completely separate, and that's because the state code requires CBTA to be audited and admit that audit process is administered through the Auditor of Public Accounts. So there actually is an audit. The CBTA had their presentation last month, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Peterson, and that audit report has already been closed and submitted to the filing.
Approved, basically.
I would anticipate an additional memorandum of understanding with Plan RVA after the June. I'm speaking no authority other than just being on it. It will probably be adjusted for changes that are taking place in the CBTA. If the CBTA brings on an executive director, that will definitely affect how the memorandum of understanding is. But even so, I doubt the CBTA is going to bring on enough staff that we can do without Plan RVA. So I think Plan RVA is going to be planning to continue
Be a partner. in the
providing
deal.
support with the CBTA.
Right. Richmond oversees the audit. Richmond has oversight of audit functions of CBTA.
Okay.
Is my understanding.
That's correct.
Is that right? Okay. All right, where were we? Page 42.
expenditures for federal awards for the year ending June 30th.
Mark, I guess.
Mhm.
Okay,
Fortunately blended. So it's.
so on the page 42, the statement of expenditures of federal awards shows just a little more than $2 million of federal expenditures for the year. Starting on page 44, this is the standard compliance, government auditing standards report for compliance. It is a unmodified, a standard report. We did not find any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses when in our internal control testing or our review of the grant documentations. The second report on page 46. This one is specific to compliance. The first one is for internal controls. Again, this is the standard unmodified report with no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses noted.
Mhm.
And the last page of the document is the summarization of schedule of findings and question costs, indicating no material weaknesses, no significant deficiencies, and no findings. So that's a pretty quick and dirty cover. If you guys have specific questions, what I would do is point to a footnote on page 36, which kind of discusses the issue you guys were talking about. Indicating the commission serves as the fiscal agent for Richmond Regional Transportation Organization. So that footnote at the bottom of page 36 has been in there for about 10 years.
Other questions and concerns, members, any questions or concerns? We're just walking through the audit at this point. Just finished. But year ended June 30th, 2021.
I guess we need to confirm from Mark again. This is a clean audit, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Standard
Everybody did everything perfect.
Mark,
Yes, sir.
are there any suggestions that you have going forward?
No, I mean, as far as suggestions, we had identified some differences in some of the
into it, we had found out that they had already addressed the issues. They had brought up they had documented procedures for making sure that any differences in payrolls would be addressed. So there were no questions or recommendations based on that because they'd already addressed them.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, you need a recommendation to send this to the.
Yep, any more questions? Any more comments? Let's just get, if I have one to bring up. Beyond any.
Pass this forward to the plan RBA without recommendation for acceptance.
Second.
It's been moved in properly. Second, any additional discussion? Comments relative to the audit? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, sign of aye. Aye. Those opposed and abstentions. All in agreement, issued unanimous to pass to organization. Recommend acceptance of the audit as presented by our external auditor. Any more comments or questions? Approved it. All right, hearing none. What's next on our the discussion items and updates? Boston, we have a number of items I'm sure that members are concerned about. So this is your time to give us an update as to where we are. And of course,
Mark, I'll just say you are absolutely, oh, he's, okay. I was gonna say, he's welcome.
He's back.
Oh, you're welcome to stay. And certainly I think if there are questions that come up from an audit perspective, we'd welcome your input. So we're going to transition to the next item now.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and leave. If you do have questions that pop up, you can shoot me an email or give me a call and I can pop in.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to share an update about where we are with the office space effort. As you know, we're reaching that critical time as we approach the end of the calendar year to be narrowing the field. Each of you received a communication from me in October that shared the market survey results with a list of 20 properties that have been identified.
I didn't get it.
Really?
I didn't receive that.
Better confirm that it had arrived. I'll make sure that you get a copy.
I'm sorry. I would have definitely looked
We'll get it to you. I apologize. She had shared with me that she got it, so,
at it. That is not my assistant, but
okay,
she would have given it probably. Okay.
okay. The market survey resulted in identification of 20 properties that were evaluated internally from staff, and we solicited input from members of the committee and the executive committee. We scheduled visits to 10 of those properties. Mr. Addison actually volunteered to sit in on the second day of the tour, so he was able to visit, I think about 4 or 5 of them. So I'm really appreciative of you participating in that. From that list, we were able to pull together the staff team that participated in the site visits and evaluate those sites and solicit. We have issued an RFP to 5 of the sites that we visited, and then the 6th being this site, to be able to solicit proposals essentially from the property owners. The RFP included questions, and I will distribute this to everybody so that you have a copy of it. You can see exactly what was provided. We solicited the proposals. They had 5 days to respond. Today is the deadline to respond. So we'll have that back, but it's general information about the property, an initial lease term of at least 7 years. That was based on the conditions of satisfaction that this body had approved earlier this year. We've set a commencement date for targeting around November 1st of 2022. Abuts to the day up to our expiration of our lease agreement here. So the idea would be that we would assume the new lease the day after this one expires. A commitment for the use of the property for our general purposes of operation and hosting of public meetings. We're have indicated that our overall anticipated need is somewhere between 10 and 11,000 square feet. Just for a point of reference, we currently occupy and lease 13 and some change right now. When we were having custody of the site, the space that occupied by LMR, that was at 16,000 square feet. So several years ago, we reduced our footprint down to about 13,000. And then, as you know, we sublease about 8,000 or so from to Homeward. So we're down to quite a bit. The 10 to 11,000 square feet of usable space in the RFP is calculated as a result of the workshop that we had with this group, as well as with our staff, identifying the number of staff and estimations for work schedule and trying to accommodate to a certain extent, but with the expectation that all staff would be having a workspace here on site. We did not contemplate that there would be a significant or even an influential segment of our staff that would be working remotely. So that's an important thing to consider. We also did account for additional space for the Central Virginia Transportation Authority in anticipation of office space and under the staffing plan that the CVTA has been contemplating over the next couple of years. We've incorporated that in the space needs, as well as meeting and conference space, large rooms, something similar to this, but also smaller and medium sized rooms to be able to accommodate committee meetings and or other types of either staff meetings or smaller group meetings that we would host.
Good question. You asking for the lease to start the day that this lease ends?
Yes.
How do we physically transition from one to the other?
I had the same question.
So, I mean, that seems to me we need at least a month over.
We asked for, I think it's 15 days in the RFP of time advance of the lease commencement date to be able to do that turnover. So as Mr. Berkey explained to me, it's customary that the lease start date would be so that there's no overlap, but we would ask for the weeks prior to the lease start date to have access to the site to be able to have that transition occur.
Right, so that has.
Yes, it has been factored in. So I was concerned about the same thing. It didn't quite match up with me about how you make a move like that.
So that might actually include building walls and putting up doors.
Construction would actually start before and would be finished prior to that November 1st start date. So the site would be expected on November 1st to be ready for our occupancy and use at full tilt. We've asked that each of the 6 properties that we solicited to provide their best base rental rate. And so that would factor in, really where we're calculating. We of course have their list prices, but in this market in particular, that isn't always the most reliable. And we've also asked them to provide any offerings that they would suggest with regard to rent abatement. So as an example, when we renegotiated this lease, we had certain perks that were incorporated into the deal. We had tenant improvements that were negotiated to occur at a midpoint of the lease period. We had some, actually, for a couple of years, we had the first month of the new lease cycle where the escalation occurred, where we would actually have the rent at no cost. So there were things like that. So we've asked them, each of the proposals, to include some kind of a plan for rent abatement. Certainly there, we also have asked in another section for the properties to each offer suggestions for how they would finance tenant improvements. So that build out that you're talking about, what that would do to either the base rate or how that would be incorporated into the deal. The expectation is that we do not want to have to fund tenant improvements above and beyond our monthly lease payment. So we want to essentially finance that in the lease agreement.
Who are the other 5 RFPs besides this?
Yeah.
I will
And-
send the sites out to you.
Did the real estate agent get that list? I mean, is that who made that list of suggestions?
They did the Tallheimer did a market survey, and then we distributed those 20 properties. We actually had
No,
about.
I mean the questions you're asking them to respond to.
Yes, that this was generated by the realtor. We
Yeah.
reviewed it with Mr. Winslow and legal counsel to make sure that it was comprehensive of all the things that we wanted to include.
Well, I'm interested in what Canova said. Can you give us a real quick rundown
Sure.
of the approximate, the locations?
Yeah,
approximately?
absolutely.
Like one's in eastern Richmond, the other one's in western Henrico, one's in northern Chesterfield, and anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quick-
So
quick
the first is on Hull Street in the Manchester neighborhood. And these are in no particular order,
Yeah.
but just the first on my list. The next one is also in the Manchester neighborhood on 7th Street. So that's a perpendicular. The corrugated box building is the name of it. There was a third in Manchester called the Manchester Mid-Century. 2 of those buildings are what I would consider to be like an adaptive reuse, former commercial or industrial use that has been converted into a retailer office. The first property I mentioned is a new construction building, and it's actually under construction right now. So we took a hard hat tour of that particular site. The fourth site is also an adaptive reuse. It's the historic trolley barn. You might have read about that in the Richmond Business Sense in the last couple of months. But it's up on Brook Road, north of the downtown area, right off of the Chamberlain exit on 64. So it drops you right at that building from that exit. And then the fifth building was the Cavalier Arena, which is in the Scott's Addition neighborhood on McTavish Avenue. We did also look at the other 5 sites that we looked at were one at the Village Shopping Center on Patterson next to the Publix grocery store. There was a 2nd floor site there. We visited what I would call 3 sort of very similar to this building, legacy kind of suburban office park buildings, one on Staples Mill Road, right across from Libby, the new Libby Town Center area. One on Laburnum in the same complex where we used to occupy office space, right at the Interstate Commons development property
That
there.
was really convenient.
Yes,
Yeah,
very
get
much
off the
so.
Interstate.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And then, forgive me, I'm blanking on the last.
The ones in Manchester, how close are they to some sort of like expressway exit or?
So they're right off of 95.
Maury,
The
Maury exit.
Yeah, the Maury Street exit on 95.
Alright.
The Hull Street property literally is 2 blocks away from the exit. So where you're either on ramping or off ramping. The other 2 properties you would navigate, maybe 4 to 6 blocks to get to
And
the
they all
sites.
have a bus route near them?
Yes, part of the criteria, at least at the staff level review, was to be much more accessible to transit. So while we do have a stop out here, it's not the most accessible from those that, it would take about 2 hours to ride the bus to this office space from most of the other locations.
So all of the ones that we have, that are receiving RFPs from are in city limits.
They actually are.
Do they all have adequate parking?
That's a great question. Yes, that was a major factor. We were testing, if you will, for kind of all modes to make sure. I will admit that, and Mr. Addison can probably speak to this since this is an area of passion for him. But, the Scotts Addition, I think, probably has the least opportunity for parking. There are 2 lots, one surface lot on the property, the rentable space. And then there's another that's catty corner that's about 45, I think, spaces. The on-site parking space is about 20. So we would have to kind of negotiate how we did staff parking versus guest parking and when we had meetings and that kind of thing. The other sites all had parking on-site adjacent to the property, pretty quick, easy access. And all appear to meet our, what we consider to be kind of our minimum parking requirement. We have 25 plus staff members, plus on, as you know, on a meeting day, we have anywhere between, commission days, we have 30 some board members right now, plus, anyone else that might be traveling to that meeting. So we wanted to take that into consideration.
The village has a crossover of 2 different bus lines. And I'm just thinking it's half in the city and half in the county. So it probably has sufficient parking because of what time of day we meet.
Yeah,
1
it's
o'clock.
that shopping center is interesting because there's parking in the rear.
Yeah.
That's
so
not
that's what
as
I
well
was thinking.
known.
Oh,
So
yeah, that's where
you know,
I park all the
yeah.
time.
So was kind of interesting.
I only add that because, that's what I was thinking. There are 2 bus, that's what I was thinking in terms of bus lines, parking spaces. Yeah. So there would have to be some paid parking in Scotts Addition.
As of right now, and we've asked each of the proposals to speak to parking availability, but what was communicated to us in the listing and the showing was that those spots, access to the surface lots would not be an additional fee. But that's part of the request to verify, what is the actual fee structure for provision of parking.
How's
That's
lighted?
an important factor.
How's it lighted for the area in which we are?
That's a great question. I mean, we visited in the daytime, so
Okay.
we weren't able to kind of test that.
That's okay.
Most of the properties, 4 of the properties that we visited are in pretty dense areas with lots of kind of mixed use happening around them. So that definitely would suggest to me that city street lighting and that kind of thing is pretty ample available.
Okay.
The trolley barn is a little bit on its own parcel. So that would be reliant on property on premise lighting. And we continue to convey the importance of lighting here. I will say that the owners here are, if not already completed, in process of transitioning all of the lighting out in this parking lot to LED lights. And that is, and they're going to be looking at pruning the trees. That's been a big challenge. So they've been attentive, or at least committed to be attentive to the concerns that we have about lighting here.
Can I go back to schedule?
Sure.
This committee is responsible for making recommendations to Plan RVA. And so we're getting the RFPs in today. When, I guess we all need to get copies of these to review.
Yes.
And so that our next meeting is not the time we need to decide what we're going to recommend to Plan RVA.
Yeah, I think 2 things could happen. I think that you could have a special meeting in December to review the information. A lot of that probably depends on whether or not you like what you see in the RFPs and you think it's a good base to start winnowing that down. We certainly would not enter into negotiations with all of them. We would narrow this pretty quickly. And so if there were other properties that we wanted to consider or solicit, we would want to do that in the month of December and not wait. So I think a lot of it results in me packaging these to you and getting them in your hands that you can look over, ask any questions that you have, get feedback. And then I think, frankly, by the December 9th board meeting, we need to have an understanding of whether we want to pursue the lot that we have, properties in the lot that we have, or we need to go back out and look at what else is out there. Another element of the RFP was to inquire whether any of the property owners were willing to fund a space fit test for us. So I think you know better than anybody. While we've spec'd 10 to 11,000 square feet, depending on what the actual footprint of the building is, that could go up or down. And so depending on how efficiently we can develop that space really will depend on, ultimate annualized costs and that kind of thing. So we've asked them if they would include in their response a commitment. This site has already committed to and has ordered a space fit plan. And so we have already been working on the plans for what this reconfigured leasable space would look like and what the square footage needs would be so that they can give their kind of best and final offer.
You mean this space?
This building.
This building.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
you would, that was gonna be my question. We don't need as much square footage. So is that what you had part of the request for this building,
So I'll say two things.
to reduce, and would they be reducing the cost of the rent? Those are some big issues. here.
My expectation would be that the price per square foot offer would be less than what we are paying now, based on what their published advertised, lease rates are for the unoccupied portions of this building. There has been some movement in this building among some of the tenants, and so there is an opportunity for us to explore other parts of the building. And so we've been looking at that, and we've actually been contemplating a scenario where office workspace for staff is upstairs and accessible meeting space is downstairs. That helps, frankly, address some of the accessibility concerns that we have with the space. And so we've been looking at that in the space test fitting exercise to be able to see how we can maximize that opportunity.
Let me get back to, you just said we need to take this to Plan RVA, the full mission on the 9th. That's only 2.5 weeks away.
No, I think that there needs to be a report to the full commission as to whether or not we're moving down the track or we need to reconsider other options. I don't think that the full board, I don't think Mr. Winslow is expecting the full board to entertain that discussion.
You're thinking executive committee is what you're
Yeah.
thinking.
So, I think that the steps are when the RFP results come in, that material gets distributed to you all. And then you
So
give
we
me
need to have a
feedback
meeting,
as soon as you
December meeting.
can.
We need to have a
Yes.
December meeting to-
Yeah,
To
and then
review
we know
before
whether
executive
we
meeting.
need to have a special meeting to regroup or we're having a special meeting to really refine.
Well, I'm not even too sure that we can do a decent review before the 9th.
Yeah, it's very tight.
But we can tell them what we're doing.
I think you'll know whether there's anything that's feasible. But yeah, if it on first view looks like there's some feasible options, that's one direction. But if you look at it and you say none of these are a good fit, then
Well, that's
But I would say what we've got, this committee needs to rank them too,
Mhm.
from top to bottom, so as to where we start negotiating
Yeah.
to make a recommendation.
Mhm.
But
I mean,
needs to have,
everybody.
which is basically another item I was going to bring up later, but we need to have time to see these and each of us have time to digest what.
yeah,
what
it's
has
gonna
been
be a lot of
proposed.
material. Yeah.
And,
Yeah, where are we in terms of our original? We had a overall original schedule we looked at last year. So we looked at in terms of the time and where are we relative to that? That schedule that we had looked at and discovered.
The schedule was that we would be moving in December toward property identification and
Identified in
negotiation.
December and maybe
So,
what about January, February?
We didn't count January as a month of activity because
Okay.
typically the commission doesn't meet. So
In January, okay.
the idea was that depending on the build out needs, we really wanted to make sure that we had enough lead time for construction material ordering and the like. So we really wanted to be able to get that going in the latter part of February or the beginning part of March.
Just make sure we don't use any materials that have to be shipped in on the west coast.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are most of these venues in the 8,000 square foot range?
They range from availability. Some of them have, multiple floors available in their spaces. So in some of the spaces, we looked at a couple different suite options and that kind of thing. But all of them have more space available than we need and are, I'm sorry, I have a difficult, they are dividable.
Okay.
I can't say divisible. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
I haven't done this kind of thing a whole bunch of times. Seems like every time there are 10 suggested, there are 10 that you're examining, one gets immediately, it's no good. And 1 or 2, maybe 3 or even 4 pop right up. But you gotta, I've had stacks like this on my desk to go through each one and each contract. And you need time. I mean, that's the other thing. You have to read it and make notes and that sort of thing. But usually one comes up that,
I think there's
no good. You know, it's
a response
you have to look at it.
from those that the ones that I went to. There was very quickly divide between which ones were routine and like, yeah, this is a typical office versus this would be a really good spot. That would be, I think, emblematic of what this organization represents and means, but more importantly, it would create, I think, just the 3 of the places I saw that I liked have parking, they're accessible, and they're unique. And when you put that before what we were focusing on with public transportation and bike trails and everything else, one of them could be along the line of the fall line trails close to, which could be really
Is that the one on the
important.
road?
Yeah.
Yeah. that's what I
And
was
so
thinking.
when you think about the potential where this goes, there's a lot of potential of looking at just what those have. And that one has parking, that one has accessibility. It's right off the highway. And it could be where we also put maybe BRT north-south too, or something of the likes. So there's an opportunity where you start seeing there's a really interesting melting pot of potential where it's not just the space. I think that was the thing we started talking about as a group was, yeah, we have a checklist, but we also have to think about, it's the place we're making for this body to exist. And now that we have the CBTA and these other committees and other pieces, there's also more than just making sure we have adequate office space. It was also how this embraces kind of our principles and everything else, while also being accessible and having highway access and parking. So,
We tried that about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And it ended up that we were looking at the, right there at the end of Burnham Avenue, where it ends at the interstate, and it was the building where it was the RFP building. We considered purchasing it. It was on the market for $350,000.
Wow.
Nothing. And we went through a very long process and chose not to do that because it would be an ongoing expense. And as I always mention about the reason we have the $1 million is because at any time, the General Assembly could disband us.
Mhm.
It would take away half of what we needed. I think there'll always be an MPO, so the federal level, but they might disband us and do it some totally new way. And I keep seeing that though, even at the federal level. Well, we've had smart scale now come up. That's like, it changed everything. We stopped everything. All the money stopped and then we had to redo everything.
Wow.
So don't think that it won't happen. So that was just why we chose not to purchase it. But it was, it sounds like what we were talking about here. Just a little
No.
warning.
background's important.
So 7-year contract, and that's the other thing. Is that sort of standard or is a 5-year contract standard?
Our conditions of satisfaction said that we were interested in anything between, I think, 7 and 11 years. Sometimes there are, in the kind of rent abatement offering, there might be something like there's the final year or somewhere embedded in that. So they have to recoup, the concessions that are given. So that's why it's an odd number. But we felt like, frankly, 5 years for a body, an organization like this is way too frequent to be trying to undertake discussions like this. And we also, on advice from the Brian Berkey, felt like 7+ makes us very desirable. We are completely hear everything you just said, but in comparison to other types of organizations, we are a very attractive tenant, and that was our hope, to be able to represent that, that we are on solid financial footing. We are a creature of the state, and we do have, reliability in our revenue and cash flow to be able to be a long-term tenant, which is attractive, particularly in this market.
But when that $1 million we have in reserve, again, it was structured that way because there was a large amount of money that would be needed if we had to move out of this building, if we were to break the lease and leave. So what if that would be in the lease, right?
We've already been advised that
Just what's legal
terms in the lease agreement for our current arrangement, I think could be improved. And certainly if there were a need for the organization to contract in space due to some kind of a, an economic condition or leave the space altogether, we would want to have those terms more favorably, in our favor, described in the lease
Either
agreement.
here or with any other.
That's correct.
place.
So
Yeah,
Mr.
because this was a
Gregory,
bad.
on his review, has already advised that he thinks that there are improvements to those terms in our agreement that could give just more opportunity to not be on the hook if something terrible were to happen.
Well,
Mr.
that's
Chairman,
what
I
the real
agree.
estate agent, a real estate agent would work on that. That's, but I think
Yeah.
that's a priority like parking.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mr. Peterson. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'm trying to get back on some kind of schedule here. We
Okay.
still got a November deadline, and we're gonna have to have some construction time and the design time in there. So I'm sort of trying to backtrack on the same thing. Normally, we don't have a full commission meeting in January.
Mhm.
We are having one here in December, but that's just 2.5 weeks away.
That's right.
Mhm.
Yes. Assuming you've got all the RFPs in today.
Mhm.
Sort of saying, when can we have them? How long do we need before we get back together in December? Now, just because the full commission is not meeting, I think that we could probably take the chance that the 5 of us would still be around.
Yeah, we could do an emergency meeting. We could do an
And have a
emergency.
January meeting.
We could do
But
it
once
January.
we
Yeah.
rank the RFPs, assuming that we see 1 or 2 that
Mhm.
we think are acceptable. How long is it gonna take to negotiate the final lease once we have determined who we want to negotiate with? And should we do that before we take it to the full commission?
I think it will be important for any terms and conditions that we believe are absolute to be agreed upon by the body before going into negotiations. Because, we will lose time, to your point, if we have to wait for responses between board meetings. So we have the set of conditions of satisfaction. It's that sort of the base framework. We have a targeted dollar amount that we've set in closed session that we want to make sure that we are at. And so my thought is that if during the month of December, there can be consensus among the finance committee members of the direction that we want to go, then I think to your point, we have the opportunity with the January cancellation to either meet as a committee in lieu of that meeting, and or convene the executive committee to meet at the same time in a joint meeting to be able to make sure that we've got the authority to at least move part in some way to that negotiation period. And the idea would be that February, there would be a lease agreement coming before the full commission to
approve.
review.
Oh,
Yeah.
approve.
Well, generally speaking, if we we rank one, so let's say we said 3 of them would be okay, we ranked them 1, 2, 3.
Mhm.
We want to negotiate with the number 1 rank.
That's
And
correct.
if it doesn't work, then you go to number
That's
2.
correct.
Right.
And see what you can work out with them. But that takes a little time to see what's going to happen. And I think once it goes to the
Mhm.
full commission, we ought to be ready to make a decision.
Yeah, and I mean, I think,
That probably, so that sounds like that needs to be our February meeting,
that's
if
right.
they make a decision.
That's
Yeah, I would agree. And we need to make sure that they have information before they need to make a decision.
Yeah.
Even though it's our recommendation, we want to make sure they're on board.
Yeah, just
I think it's important.
a small thing, just
Yeah.
this meeting today.
Yeah.
We had, this was fairly simple on this, but at the same time, we had not seen in the minutes before we got here today, nor have we
Right.
seen the audit before we got here.
Right.
We should have had this at least by last week.
Yes.
You should
5 days
have,
ahead of time?
you should have received it last week. This was
I had-
distributed last week.
Now I got this, but I didn't get the list of that one.
Okay, I did get it. I did receive it. Yeah.
Over the weekend.
Yeah, they
So
did
I
send
got
it out.
this
Well, maybe
personally.
Thank
I
I
got this on
apologize
Thursday.
about that.
Yeah. Yeah, they sent it out.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of the lease, back to the lease, in terms of renewables, those are gonna be some pretty important legal things to look at, renewables and inflation. if there's inflation, because of inflation, I think that's gonna be something that's gonna be a
When you
little
say, when you
paramount.
say renewables, what do you-
Renewable period, we have, can we do a renewable? I think it's pretty
Renewable
customary.
terms, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty standard to have a renewable option,
Oh,
5-year renewable option or whatever.
Yeah.
If we decide we
No, I
need
get
to
it.
stay and we
I
can have
know,
that.
I see.
We did include in the RFP, tenant requires 2 options to extend on all or part of its premises under the same conditions of the lease for an additional term of up to 5 years each.
Okay.
So we built that in.
Okay,
And
good.
we
Starting at
also,
5 years and then renew.
5-year. The 5 years
Yes.
each for renewable periods, I think she said.
and we
Under the-
did set in
doesn't
some
work
standards
out.
around what the expectations of escalation would be on those, so that,
Yeah.
to your point, to how.
Yeah.
Because it was virtually impossible to get out of this lease. And
Yeah.
I'll make sure the next time it's not
Sounds
that hard. That-
Right.
We have an exit plan, right?
Yeah,
We
in
just need to-
case, yeah, this,
And-
Martha,
Yes.
of all, when we sent out the request for RFPs, did we include in that request all of the things that we have determined are mandatory on our part? Or is that a separate list that we have to have?
We included all of the things that we felt were appropriate to share with the proposers to give us the information we need. We did withhold some key elements because we want to maintain leverage for negotiation. So as an
Okay.
example, the things that we discussed in closed session where we have targets around leasable costs and some things like that, we obviously did not want to disclose that.
Would you just send all that information to us
Absolutely.
along with the RFPs?
Absolutely.
So
Yes.
we can use that as a follow.
I will say too, I mean, I think Mrs. O'Bannon will definitely recall this, but we also made some modifications to the standard tax that maybe a typical tenant would do around Americans with Disabilities Act compliance and accessibility. We've found particularly, I'm sure everybody has experienced this, what a building owner feels is accessible might not meet the standard for the people that we have
ADA.
visiting our space. And so we try to be really critical on those elements too. And we're very upfront and transparent with all the property owners about the importance of some of those things. Similar with access to transit and transportation, parking, those are not things that anyone can kind of hedge on. They are the absolutes that we conveyed that needed to be part of the proposal.
well, obviously it's day-to-day parking for your employees as well as.
That's right.
Any space.
That's right.
a
So
large group.
we provided in conversation with each of the listing agents where we visited the space, a little bit about kind of our ebbs and flows. There are certain weeks where we have meetings happening where we have 50 guests 3 times a week. So that is definitely something that has to be considered. It's not a rarity for us. It's common practice, month in and month out. So my expectation is with the holiday, I'm hoping to get this package tomorrow. I will let you know if I do not, so that you know that. My hope would be that I can turn it around by Friday or Saturday, so that it's in your inboxes. Literally, I do plan to take Thursday as a holiday, but I plan to be able to get this to y'all as soon as possible.
You're kidding. You're gonna take Thursday?
I do, yes.
Yeah.
So that's my plan, and I'll certainly let you know if anything changes, if that isn't allowed. And I will communicate with you all and the members of the executive committee, because I think one of the things that Mr. Winslow and I have talked about is just making sure that we keep both bodies just as actively informed as possible, so that by the time we get to, say, a February meeting, that one is inclusive of all 9 jurisdictions, but it also gives, I think, the participation coverage of all the people who have expressed interest in this subject.
Yeah. That's good. I don't need it this weekend because I won't be to review it next week.
Well,
Maybe
whenever you get back to your normal schedules,
Yeah,
Monday or
next
whatever,
week.
it's there for you. So that's my goal. I did just want to mention one other thing. Couple of factors just to kind of let you all know about, and some of them are finance related and a little bit outside on governance, but they are important to the organization. We are entering the season of local government budget requests. So I'll be preparing those as instructions come to us for how to submit. Each of the 9 localities have a little bit of a different process. We've been analyzing our population data, and as you can imagine, almost all of the jurisdictions in our region are growing at actually a very healthy rate. So, you know, that's nice. Charles City County is the exception. They did have a decline in population from the verified numbers of 2010 to 2020. It's pretty modest. It's less than 500 people, but
That's not modest in their case.
well, true.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
Remember his
That's-
is huge.
10 families. So I did want to just kind of get a temperature check from the committee. I think that previously, you know, the last 2 fiscal years, we've gone with the reduced per capita rate at 50 cents per capita in light of the pandemic conditions
Right.
and the economic concerns. I was wondering if there was support to be able to go back to our usual rate of 55 cents per capita.
Wouldn't we have voted on that at the next meeting?
It will be on the agenda, but it would be nice to know the temperature of the finance
What
committee so that,
supports.
you know, so that as
What
we
show-
submit.
My thoughts are very simple. Let's look at let's look at what it needs to be. And if we can show what it needs to be, then that's what, I think that's what the jurisdiction is going to have to deal with. If, you know, 50 cents is going to cover all our expenses because of the increased population. Then that's one thing. If we need to have additional to do the work we need to do, we need to address it that way.
I agree.
Yes.
I'll also share that we have a meeting set up with Mr. Brebno from the Greater Planning District Commission and Dr. Casey and probably
Good.
members of his team to talk about the jurisdictional split.
Yeah.
Because that's another
Split
factor in this
population.
as to whether or not the whole of Chesterfield, the numbers that I'm working with actually exclude the Tri-Cities portion of Chesterfield in our numbers. And then the other piece of this is in particular for Hanover County, we have conflicting numbers from Census and Walden Cooper, so I'll be working with the town of Ashland to be able to reconcile that. It's a 308 person difference right now, so we're just trying to figure out the census tracks. But more importantly, Hanover County in the 2020 census has moved over the population threshold, and so you all will be eligible for a new seat. And so I know that that's something we've talked about before, but there will be an official communication coming out to Mr. Badesky for your organizational meeting in January. And then as a reminder to everyone, for the jurisdictions who do have multiple seats for elected officials, under the charter provisions and bylaws revisions, you do have the ability to appoint multiple voting seats to a single person. So I think that that'll be this January will be really the first time the jurisdictions have contemplated that. But Mr. Gregory is working with Mr. Winslow and local legal counsel to be able to provide guidance material for you as you move into your appointment season in January, to be able to look at that, in particular how you treat alternates, because our jurisdictions have kind of all had a little bit of a different slant on interpreting that. So that's just some more things kind of coming that are sort of related to finance, but in the governance space as well.
Well, TPO has been doing that for longer than Plan RVA.
Right,
So
yes.
learn from that.
Yeah, you have a different voting structure in the blocks of votes that are allocated. Yeah. So those are just a couple of other things that are happening kind of behind the scenes in the coming month. I think the biggest, back to the member dues, the biggest unknown for me is as this office space effort is underway, the projections for the cost of moving or staying and the cost of those associated costs that might be one time. So that'll be the biggest kind of question mark that we're sorting through. We're actually going to be presenting in January information to you about recommendations for adjusting the revenue projections for this fiscal year and expense projections. We have received grant awards that were not included in the approved budget. So that's good news. And things are on that front very positive at this point in time. So that'll be something to look forward to in January. Dan, do you have other things that you want to share with the committee? I know we have kind of a running list of projects and activities.
Financial reports and that sort of thing.
Right. To kind of tie between the audit and looking forward. Mark did bring up an interesting point at the end when he asked for improvement recommendations. You know, he did notice that there were, a couple of things that didn't reconcile, and he took a first look at them. We were able to sort it out. During fiscal 21, you had a couple of very significant changes. One was personnel your finance director position from Terry Eck out. And then an interim person, Jill, and then to me, and then, that created a lot of change. That created a lot of differences in how things get done when you have a full-time person versus a part-time person.
Well, that was the question, is Mr. Van Dorn going to be, are you going to be here forever? Or do we hire a new person? That was just one of the
Yeah,
questions.
probably not forever, but one of the things that's actually on this list of things to do is to analyze and make a recommendation as to what the finance director position should look like for Plan RBA and for any contingency with CBTA. And so is that, me personally, or is that, whatever, but that's part of what Martha and I are discussing. And then the other part was with COVID, you had, all of a sudden you distributed everybody. And that changes your internal control. And so there were a few things there. And so part of what we need to be doing is kind of updating our processes, our policy procedure to meet the needs of this new environment that we're working in. And so we're kind of looking for this January meeting. We'll have a couple of items regarding budget, policy, and process, including changes that we discussed. We've got the information system.
Yeah, but yeah, that's one thing on my
And
information system
some recommendations as to how to proceed.
and the cost.
And also just how you look at your structure financially. You just received a financial statement, which is a pretty good document. From an operational standpoint, it's not all. You have so many things going on here that being able to look at your components of your organization and really what drives the finances of the organization is very important. There's information developed that will help with some of the questions that have actually been discussed around the table now in the previous meetings. So a lot of that is coming forward from, you just received a big clean audit opinion, no internal control issues, nothing that actually raised to a level of a recommendation, even a management letter. So all that's very solid. The next part is, building kind of how your information works and your finances work. And that's kind of what we're looking forward to go from here. I was glad that we received an audit opinion. Some recommendations to be done, a lot of potential changes.
And we do have the audit RFP essentially ready to go, so that'll be released. At this point, I think it's better to just release it right after the start of the calendar year. But we are at the end of the engagement with Donna Off-Campus Road,
That's the
so
question. Yeah,
that'll be another.
yeah, that's something we want to look at going forward. In addition to the new system, I think that's pretty important to start making a decision as a body regarding continuation on the RFPs relative to the audit, external audit. So it's very important along with the system. And of course, I think it's also important. I mean, fortunately, we ended the year financially good, ahead, not behind, which is remarkable, I think. But where are we as of October 31st? That's all that. So next time we meet, hopefully we have an idea of our financial condition, financial position in the ensuing months.
Right. The next meeting is January, so I would anticipate we'll be looking at it December 31.
You can have December, okay.
financial report.
Okay.
I think I'll just say the other thing that I know Mark touched on this afternoon in the audit presentation, but Dave and I have spoken just a little bit about it. But as part of the system design and management tools, a really concrete example of that is the reality of the changes in deferred inflows and outflows for the Virginia retirement system have significant impact on the results. I mean, you saw, from an operating perspective before those adjustments, we were at $167,000, net income, so to speak. But after those adjustments and with consideration of our fiduciary policy, that reduced down to about 42,000. So those are, in our organization, big sways. And so that's one of the things that we really want to be, as much as we can, on top of. They are not necessarily adjustments that we can predict. And so that is another sort of factor in our planning that, we want to get away from probably the hope for the best kind of thing and really prepare for the worst. And think about that as we make some of the decisions that we're making. So these tools and things like that, I think, are becoming ever critical.
And to piggyback on that, in your statements, you see you have two balance sheets, you have two income statements. And the reason is the first two statements include long-term issues like pensions and capital items. Your second statements are probably more what you may be used to in government, which is kind of your short-term view. What did we do this year? How does your cash turnover? And some of what we're looking at is how do those come together and how do you manage that day to day? That cash flow, making sure you're okay, but also how do you invest your fund balance and what are the risks to your fund balance and the risk to your organization? And so how do you best position from both of those perspectives? Life can be great month to month, but if there's a significant change in the funding stream, then what does that do? If there's a big sway in the market, it may not affect your cash so much, but it may affect all the actuarial assumptions in your pensions. And so it still has something that you need to consider. And so that's where some of the, I guess kind of what I say, going down to the next level of knowing how the organizational flux on those types of issues. That's what we're looking at.
That's important. It brings up the due structure too.
That's what I was thinking.
The due structure in terms of that has to be factored in.
Yeah.
But we have a lot to consider going forward this year.
What
Our
is
financial
what
position.
is the new census number for the entire aircraft region?
I can't tell you, but I can look it up.
You can memorize it?
No, I don't.
And when you mentioned the Weldon Cooper thing, Henrico County sued them.
I remember you talking about that, yeah.
They
The
didn't ask me.
unadjusted is 1,120,304. When we adjust the Chesterfield County portion out, we lose 44,947 people. So that brings it down to 1,075,357.
So basically, $100,000 for Benny. The dues. Is what we're talking about.
Yeah,
So when you
55,
start
yeah,
looking-
yeah.
So when you're looking at your 50 cents versus 55,
Right, yeah, 5 cents per capita is about $53,000. So,
So.
Yeah.
So I think that's just if we look at it in those terms, what do we need for the budget to work?
Yeah.
We could work from.
Yeah, that's a good point in light of the new financial system and also in light of the moving costs that may be incurred, the cost of transition.
Couldn't that
That
be a
has to be-
one-time thing?
It's a one-time thing, but it's gonna hit you hard this year. And the next year, next 12 months, we're gonna be impacted by it.
Oh, yeah.
Within the next 12 months, you will say, Dan,
Yes.
I said next 12 months, and that's what I'm concerned about. So one thing we gotta remember is where we were in terms of monthly income loss. We gotta remember that we were there. We managed to escape that through the spring of last year.
Office spaces, there's so much left over, right? I mean, there's a lot that's not being used right now. Wouldn't they pay us to move?
Sure, they'll make this thing work.
I don't see a problem with that at all.
If you can get the deal.
well, I just wanted to say thank you all. I mean, coming out of another audit process and having a consecutive set of fiscal years where we're operating with a contribution to the fund balance. It's
Yes.
a nice place to be, and it's definitely a credit to the work from the people around the table. So I just really wanted to say I appreciate your all's commitment to sitting in these meetings and giving feedback and suggestions, and today's been really good too. We are working hard. We meet weekly, Diane and Dan and I, to keep these balls moving forward. So it's, we're committed to it, and we really thank you guys for what you're doing too.
Yeah, let me join before we adjourn to say thank you to you, Martha, and certainly you, committee, and all of you for that outstanding work. And hopefully we can simplify the information if you can, and balance sheets and that position, so we can hopefully simplify and get back to, I think, what would be easily to interpret, understand, and more importantly, communicate. So again, with that thought, any other comments? If not, we stand adjourned and more in readiness or any more contributions or suggestions. I think we're pretty much on the same page. Everyone okay?
Yeah.
In terms of time. All right, very
Just
good.
one more welcome to Gilbert.
Yeah, all right, wonderful. Welcome. All right, we should have a motion to adjourn. Make a motion.
Motions, let's go with the word.
So it's been
Is there,
moved
you
and
can just say there,
second.
no more business.
It's been moved and
Second.
second. It's been moved and second. The ayes have it, we are adjourned. No more discussion,
Okay.
except personal.